Good morning, everybody. Jai Bhim. So today I'm going to talk about Dalit and African American women's solidarity. My talk is based on an article that I published in 2014, and it was titled Building Bridges, Articulating Dalit and African American Women's Solidarity. The timing today is perfect as we are going through tumultuous changes, and this is the moment to force an even radical transformative social change with Black Lives Matter and the Cisco case, as everybody is aware of today. So delving into personal experiences of Dalit and African American women's day-to-day living, I constructed a margin-to-margin framework to investigate the possibilities of solidarity between the two groups of women, given the shared history of patriarchy, as well as the ways they have been silenced by women from dominant groups, both caste groups as well as race groups. And by a margin-to-margin framework, I actually mean the juxtaposition of seemingly disparate margins. So Dalits and African Americans for my case today, in order to construct new knowledge and to enable political solidarity, to build conscious and sustained commitment to challenge social injustice. Significantly, working margin to margin privileges a vantage point from which to analyze the deep and common continuities of structures of law, education, feminism, capital, and labor affecting Dalit and African American women. An intergroup exchange and feminist engagement facilitates the envisioning of a broader and joint struggles between subordinated populations across the globe. It also promotes political possibilities for women, especially from these two communities, to express their alternative views of the conceptual categories, as well as the actual processes of caste, race, gender, sexuality, and feminisms. And as Sujata pointed out, and thank you for the generous introduction, the history of this exchange goes back at least from the Indian side to about 150 years ago, when the revolutionary non-Brahmin social social revolutionary Jyotirao Phule wrote his essay, Gulamgiri, that is slavery, in 1873. And in my talk today, I'm going to focus on three themes that will enable us to really think about how we can think about the shared experiences of these two communities, and especially the women therein. Dalit and African American women's collective ideas, comparisons, and learning and coping strategies will allow us to build some connections and solidarities between the two dispossessed communities. So the first theme that I'm going to focus on today is the double discrimination of caste and gender, and how these women have been constructing actually theory from their everyday experiences. At the Women's Rights Convention held in Ohio in 1851, the Black feminist Sojourner Truth argued, and I quote, "Ain't I a woman? Look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most of them sold into slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me," end quote. Truth's oratory provided a powerful rebuttal to the claim that women were categorically weaker than men, something associated with middle class status and whiteness. Most important, she analyzed the specific double discrimination of Black women by their race and gender. In 1855, 4 years after Truth's claim, in a different continent and context, Muktabai Sarve, a Dalit woman, attacked the atrocities committed by Brahmins, the highest caste, against lower castes and women. Deploying her newly acquired weapon of literacy, Muktabai examined the humiliation experienced by untouchables at the hands of Brahmins. And I quote, this is what Muktabai writes. This is the first ever feminist, Dalit feminist piece that comes to us from 1855. So this is actually excavating the history of Dalit feminism. So this is what Muktabai has to write. These people, that is Brahmins, drove us, the poor monks and mahars, away from our own lands when they occupied to build large mansions. And that was not all. They regularly used to make the monks and mahars drink oil mixed with red lead and then buried them in the foundations of their mansions. We suffer so much grief on account of being branded as untouchables. Nobody employs us because we are untouchables. We have to endure miseries because we do not have any money, end quote. Muktabai described in minute detail their sufferings under the Brahmin government in the pre-colonial and colonial Bombay presidency. She thus exposed the deep social stratification in society and criticized Savarna domination. Both Truth and Muktabai underline the particular experiences of Black and Dalit women. Muktabai compared the experiences of giving birth for Dalit and Brahmin women and attempted to question upper caste women's privilege. Both of them drew attention to the inequalities of reproductive labor and their double work as workers and maternal reproducers of the menial workforce. They were constructing conceptual categories from their lived experiences of everyday discrimination and struggle at the margins of the society. Both of them asked if they were not women enough who suffered the pains of womanhood, just like white women or Savarna women. My second theme is the denial of education for Dalits and African Americans. In India and the US, dominant groups have historically denied basic formal education to Dalits and African Americans, respectively. Both institutional law and the self-proclaimed common sense law of whiteness and Hindu Shastras have reinforced the powerlessness of Dalits and Blacks and denied them education. According to the ethos of Brahmanic and white supremacy, lower castes and racial minorities were allegedly incapable of intellectual achievement, and they were often looked down upon as supposedly docile and indifferent to education. Dominant groups feared that education might bring about independence of slaves, and hence they discouraged it thoroughly. Most significant, dominant groups also instituted violence against and criminalized Dalits and Blacks if they sought to access education. In the 1740s in South Carolina, laws declared that anyone, Black or white, who taught, and I quote, any free person of color or slave to spell, read, or write shall upon conviction be fined a sum, end quote. The anti-literacy restrictions of the slave states were far more rigid than in the North. After Nat Turner's revolt in 1831, legislation prohibiting the education of slaves was strengthened throughout the South. In the words of one slave, and I quote, teaching slaves to read and write tends to lead to dissatisfaction in their minds and to produce insurrection and rebellion, end quote. According to Alabama's 1832 law and Georgia's 1828 law, Blacks would be punished by fine and whipping, or fine or whipping at the discretion of the court. Every slave state had such laws by the 1830s. Stridently unequal, Segregated schools were maintained by law with Supreme Court protection until 1954. The enslaved Mattie Jackson reported in 1866, and I quote, "I could read a little, but was not allowed to learn in slavery. I was obliged to pay 25 cents for every letter written for me," end quote. The legal sanction against education for Blacks echoed the Dharmashastra's prescription against allowing Shudras and Atishudras access to textual learning. The lawgiver Katyayan laid down that if a Shudra overheard the Veda, the king shall pour hot molten lead in his ears. Challenging such Brahmanic ideas and practices, many Dalit and non-Dalit social reformers, especially non-Brahmin social reformers, fought for Dalits and women's entry into schools, beginning especially from the middle of the 19th century. Dalit radicals have also been fighting for the ordinary human and civic rights to gain access to public water tanks, temples, and streets since those times. In general, many Dalits and Blacks understood their disadvantage and resolved that education was a key to their emancipation. Muktabai's essay of 1855 that I referred to earlier concluded with a plea to Dalits that they seek education and deploy their critical thinking skills. Similarly, the enslaved Mattie Jackson asserted in 1866, and I quote, "I would advise all young, middle-aged or old in a free country to learn to read and write. I hope they will remember the old maxim, never too old to learn. Manage your own secrets and divulge them by the silent language of your own pen." End quote. Education was thus a means to decode the workings of hegemonic structures and relationships. In 1928, 70 years after Muktabai wrote her essay, Ambedkar raised the slogan, "Educate, organize, and agitate," thus stressing that education was a prerequisite for the annihilation of caste. A Dalit feminist woman, Shantabai Dani, recalled that her mother constantly repeated Ambedkar's advice and was of the opinion that for the poor, education was a ray of hope. However, there was a deep contradiction between the promises of education made by Dalit and Black ideologues and the state and the form of education actually provided in practice. The practice of differentiation and discrimination continued against Dalits and African Americans across a range of social institutions and practices, including curriculum and the distribution of knowledge. Studies show that students were thoroughly discouraged from attending even ill-equipped schools. Dalit and African American students were subjected to psychological, social, and physical violence in schools. And hence, despite the promises of education, the actual practice became very, very tenuous. I now turn to my third theme for today, which is the entangled intersectionality of caste, race, sex, and sexuality. Beginning in the 1920s, Dalit radicals, and especially Ambedkar, authorized a redemptive role for women in both the private domain of the family and through public works. Ambedkar instructed them in regard to clean clothes, comportment, moral qualities, and respectable behavior, and emphasized moderation. However, he also encouraged women to be not only self-reliant, but also transgressive agents. His democratizing efforts, certainly, there were some contradictions, but we also need to pay particular attention to Dalit's intentions and the historical context, and the historically contingent strategies which were necessary for building self respect, self confidence, and dignity for women and Dalits as a whole. In a similar vein, growing up in the Jim Crow era, professional women remembered that their parents who had endured slavery wanted them to be well behaved, and they wanted white people to know that their children came from good homes. Parents instructed their daughters to educate themselves as well as their children. This was fundamental, they argued, to uplift their race. Hence, the parents first sought quality education for their daughters, which would ensure that economic and sexual exploitation would not be the lot of these daughters. Just as for Dalit women, African American girls and women were seen as agents or race leaders, able to uplift their communities. However, this agency was restricted, and such a promise in practice had limitations. African American women were to follow Victorian ideals of restraint regarding matters of female sexuality in order to disprove the myths of Black promiscuity, which were perpetuated by whites to justify their own actions. A strict reinforcement and disciplining came from the community and teachers who guided the young girls in what they should and should not do in order to be accepted by the ruling classes, both the white society in case of African Americans and the Savarna society in case of Dalits. And because of these multiple forms of jeopardy, both Dalit and African American women were afflicted by fragmented self-identity. Many of them contested these markers and accelerated the level of social psychological violence against them. In the 20th century, many Dalit women, especially those from the middle classes, were subjected to an intense pressure to Brahmanize, just as African American women were to adhere to rigid codes of behavior, or even to whiten their dress, language, eating habits, and so on. In the process, many Dalits and African Americans also struggled with self-hatred. Angela Davis, Assata Shakur, and other African American women have addressed the devastating impact of self-hatred on their own self-image and on their interaction with others in the community. They critiqued in particular the impact of negative values surrounding hair structure and length, skin tone, and physical features. They called each other jungle bunnies and bush bogies. These women as girls were indoctrinated into self-hatred, and they began to reject their full lips, hair, and broad noses as undesirable features. Dalit and African American middle classes' appropriation of the dominant culture operated in disjunction to their struggle for a separate culture. The torn supposedly African American and Dalit subject constantly struggle to find a breathing space and seek respectability in this consent and contest against existing hegemonies. Both Dalit and African American women have been denied privacy and protection, property, and prosperity. Both sets of women share a portrayal of being so-called promiscuous and sexually available to dominant men, as well as to men from their own communities. Colonial perception and upper caste or white stereotypes about Dalit and African American women and African American males as inferior, childlike, docile, dirty, ugly, and sexually potent was also often associated with the reputation of Dalit and African women as promiscuous. It was thought to satisfy such hot-natured women, the Dalit and the African American man had to be especially potent. Upper caste Savarnas constructed the stereotype of both the Muslim and Dalit men as potential threats to upper caste women's sexuality and honor. Seeking the pretext of protection, upper caste males crafted the so-called dangerous and sexually motivated Muslim and Dalit men as a means to restrict upper caste women's public access. According to Savarnas, Dalit women were already in the public gaze and need not concern themselves with issues of dignity and honor. Paradoxically then, when their femaleness made them sexually vulnerable to racist and casteist domination, their blackness and Dalitness effectively denied them any protection. As a result, the historic and contemporary vulnerability of these women was constructed by white or Brahmanic patriarchal codes that closely guarded white Savarna women, and on the other hand, silently institutionalized white Savarna sexual access to Black and lower caste and Dalit women. The enslaved Linda Brent recorded in 1861 that her master had told her that she was, and I quote, his property, that she must subject to his will in all things, end quote. She further argues, and I quote, women are considered of no value unless they continually increase their owner's stock. They are put on a par with animals, end quote. So the so-called slave girl, she continues, is reared in an atmosphere of licentiousness and fear. When she's 14 or 15, her owner or his sons or the overseer or perhaps all of them begin to bribe her with presents. If these fail to accomplish their purpose, she is whipped or starved into submission to their will. End quote. Brent notes that slavery makes white fathers cruel and sensual, the sons violent and licentious. Underscoring similar oppressions, Dalit women have spoken up against the traditional use of caste and sexual oppressions. They have described the fear of rape when they live in their hutments outside the village. So one woman from the Khandawala caste recorded, and I quote, she says, our women are raped not only because they are women, but also for revenge, for showing that they are a piece of property, end quote. Clearly, caste and race and gender and sexuality have compounded matters further for these women. In 1861, Brent argued, and I quote, there was no shadow of law to protect her from insult, from violence, or even from death, end quote. Thus, many women did not have the right to privacy or to protection against sexual exploitation. The renowned Dalit intellectual and scholar Anand Teltumbre has chronicled the gang rape and the public humiliation and torture that culminated in the lynching of 4 Dalit lives at the Village Square in Khairlanji, Maharashtra in 2006. The insult against Dalits has been double-edged. Savarnas signal their power to appropriate the bodies of Dalit women and also emasculated Dalit men by declaring them not strong enough to protect their women. Although socially ostracized, both Dalit and African American women are thus sexually touchable. The state's apparatus has been complicit in these oppressive practices and has exploited and alienated these women even further. In addition to this public patriarchy, Dalit and African American women are also affected deeply by private patriarchy, that is, patriarchy inside their homes, their domestic spaces. And in the interests of time, I will not go into details there, but it is important to note that except for some notable examples, in general, male Dalit and African American spokespersons have spoken for their caste or race, but have failed to seriously engage with women's experiences. By failing to prize open the constitutive role of patriarchy in shaping and maintaining caste, many intellectuals have lost the opportunity to comprehend the wider structural logic that sustains casteist and racist societies. For them, caste and race seem to be the primary challenges, and gender, class, or subcaste differences figure tangentially at best. These leaders argue that specifically speaking of women's exploitation within the community will further split the community and threaten organization and solidarity. They therefore prefer to resolve these questions within the confines of the ghar, that in Marathi, which is the home, or metaphorically the family. Hence, women have been silenced and even marginalized. Significantly, like some men in their communities, even some mainstream Savarna and white feminists have socially excluded both Dalit and African American women. Thus, in sum, learning and teaching about Dalit and African American movements, and especially women in there, and Dalit and Black feminism, provides the possibility of connecting these complex lives and allows for a broad feminist, anti-patriarchal, anti-caste, and anti-untouchability and anti-racist analysis and praxis. Such an exercise of building bridges may allow African Americans and Dalits to effectively share their experiences and struggle together for an inclusive, deeply democratic, transnational politics, and most importantly, a collective humanity. And especially in today's moment, work towards a transformative, deep social change. I thank you all.